We all can relate that when we don't sleep well or when we eat at the wrong time, then we can feel the consequences right away. It's not a disease, but it is a discomfort. When it continues for many weeks or months, then that can increase our risk for disease.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Howdy friends, great to be here with you. I hope that you've been keeping well. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. In today's episode, I sit down with Professor Satchin Panda, one of the world's leading experts interested in circadian rhythms, to dive a little deeper into circadian biology and how we can use our understanding of body clocks to shift our health in a favourable direction. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I recently had Emily Manoogian and Courtney Peterson on to discuss time-restricted eating, a method of eating usually used to describe eating within an 8 to 12-hour eating window. Today's conversation with Satchin builds on this, with many important components of circadian biology re-emphasised and plenty of new questions explored. I'm incredibly thankful to Satchin for helping us continue to explore this topic of circadian biology and believe within this conversation there are several bits of information we can use to modify our lifestyles, nurture our circadian rhythms, and improve our health. Please enjoy. This is me and Satchin Panda. Dr. Panda, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Happy to be here.
I've had a couple of episodes on fasting now. You and I were just speaking about those. One with Emily Manoogian and then a second one recently with Emily and Courtney Peterson. And since those episodes, I've received many questions from the community about time-restricted eating, how fasting works, and optimizing a fasting protocol that I'd like to sort of throw around with you today. To sort of make sense of much of this conversation, let's perhaps start with a refresher on what circadian rhythms are and why they exist.
Yeah, so circadian rhythms are daily timetable of when nearly thousands of genes in our genome turn on and off at different time of the day. And the reason why they're there is for last 200,000 years, we humans have been living on this planet with predictable changes in sunrise and sunset, the availability of light, the change in temperature and food. So that's why we have been designed to adapt to that changing environment. And when we dig deep, what we find is circadian rhythms essentially optimize our physiology, behavior, and metabolism for every hour of this 24 hours day-night cycle.
Right. So as we're going about our day, these circadian rhythms are controlling our physiology, metabolism. Can you give some examples of what are some of the things that are kind of happening in our body at different time points, and how is that sort of helping us do what we need to do throughout the day?
Yeah, so for example, if you were lucky enough to go to bed around 10 o'clock at night, then after around 7 to 8 hours, around say 8, you're supposed to wake up at 6 o'clock. But your body, your circadian clock actually prepares your body to wake up. So your breathing becomes a little faster, your heart begins to pump a little bit extra, and then your sleep hormone melatonin begins to go down so that by the time you wake up, you feel fully energetic and ready to roll. Just imagine when you set an alarm and try to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to catch a flight, to do something, you actually wake up feeling groggy, even if you tried to sleep a little early, because your clock did not allow you to prepare for the day. So that's starting from the beginning, from the day, beginning of the day. And then after waking up, within 45 minutes to an hour, your stress hormone cortisol begin to rise and reaches its peak. And that means you are even more ready after waking up to do more physical activity and get ready for the day. Then your bowel movement is most likely in the morning because that's what your clock is instructing our gut to get rid of the toxins, and then your insulin producing cells are actually primed so that you can eat your big breakfast and digest that food, absorb that nutrient without raising your glucose level too high. So these are just the examples. Even in the morning, within the first 2 hours, you can see so many things happen.
And so when we're born, are we kind of just born with these clocks, like a clock that affects, say, melatonin and cortisol, a clock that's affecting bowel movements, and how do sort of external things like cues, like the light exposure that we're getting or the timing of our meals, how do those affect those clocks and potentially lead to sort of dysregulation?
Yeah, so we all are born with the same clocks, around 24 hours rhythms. But then when babies are born, the clock is not completely wired to the rest of the body. And the reason is babies are also growing really fast. So they need to eat in every 3 to 4 hours to support their rapid growth. So for the first 6 months to a year, their physiology, metabolism is not completely wired. And this is an example where, if we have the same kind of unwired clock, then half of us would be crying and half would be hungry now. But slowly, the clocks get synchronized and our brain clock gets more connected to the organ clocks. And then we have much better rhythms in daily physiology, metabolism, and behavior. Now, the second question that you asked is, how do light and food get into these rhythms? As we all experience with the change in season, when we go from summer to winter or winter to summer, the day length changes. And so that if we're in the wild, we cannot just afford to wake up at 6 o'clock every day, because sometimes in winter it may be too dark outside, and in summer it may be too late in the morning. So that's why our clocks are wired to synchronize with the outside world, primarily through two different mechanisms. One is through light, so that as the day length changes, the first ray of light and the bright light in the morning can reset our clock so that we are in sync with the day-night cycle. So, for example, in very northern latitude, from day to day, there can be differences of 8 to 10 minutes in sunrise time. And that's why we are wired. We have specialized cells in our retina called melanopsin cells. They sense blue light, and daylight or sunlight is a very rich source of blue light. And that's how we adjust our clock to different seasons. Then the next thing is, as our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, woke up, when you are awake, we want to go find food after a few hours of waking up. So the clocks in our body, they also sense when the meal is coming, because not only we have to anticipate when the sun rises and where to wake up. If we know when the meal is likely to come, then our digestive system also gets primed for that time. So that's why when we eat also synchronizes our clock and essentially tells us this is the time when you should expect food. So those are the two major mechanisms.
Are there any other external cues that sort of have the potential to impact these circadian clocks other than light exposure and the time that we eat our food?
There are other mechanisms. For example, when we exercise can affect our clock. But in face of light and food, all these other cues are a little not that powerful. But still, we should keep those in mind so that we can use them when we cannot use light and food.
And so what's the problem, Satchin, with circadian disruption? So if these clocks are a little bit out of whack, why is that a problem from a physiological point of view and from a health point of view? And for a listener that's thinking, how would that kind of present how would that affect them in terms of how they feel or potentially their sort of long-term health?
Yeah, so just imagine if you have a 8 to 5 job, and some days, and if you are the boss, and some days some of your employees, they show up at 7:30, and then some days they can show up at 10, or they just randomly show up in the evening. They may be working hard, but then when it comes to promotion time, you may not give them a raise because they're not sticking to time. The reason is your office is also connected to the outside world through shipping, receiving, all the other stuff. So similarly, our body is wired, programmed to do certain things at certain time. And when we don't do, when our behaviors are not in alignment with what our body is programmed to do, you may not see the consequences right away. But over long term, it essentially compromises our physiology. We may not be able to digest our food properly, or we may not be able to control our blood sugar properly. So over days, months, or years, that can slowly show up as, for example, diabetes, obesity, metabolic disease. At the same time, our clocks in our immune system also make sure that we mount very strong immune reaction when we are supposed to see pathogens, which are mostly during daytime or in the evening. And at other time, the inflammation should subside, should go down when we are resting. So when our circadian rhythms are disrupted, then our immune system doesn't see that resting time or rejuvenation time. So we stay with chronic inflammation, and our risk for cancer and certain other diseases can go up. Similarly, our circadian rhythm also has downtime for our brain to repair, reset, and rejuvenate and detoxify. And if we don't sleep properly, or if you don't sleep enough, or if we have fragmented sleep, then our brain cannot repair itself. And then we can end up with affective disorder, depression, anxiety, panic attack, etc., all the way to even risk for Alzheimer's disease or dementia can also go up.
Yeah, so it really does have the capacity to affect many aspects of our health from the sounds of it. Do you have a sense as to how important circadian biology is to our health, sort of relative to some of the other big rocks that people talk about, like the types of food that we eat, or doing exercise, or smoking, or drinking alcohol? How important is kind of nurturing these circadian rhythms in the big picture?
Well, it's really hard to say. For example, smoking and circadian rhythm health are difficult to compare. So now if you think about circadian rhythms, is actually an umbrella. It's an integrating mechanism to integrate sleep, physical activity, good nutrition, all of them together. For example, if we don't sleep well, then our brain doesn't work properly to decide what to eat or how much to eat. So we end up eating energy-dense diet, or we end up overeating. So when we think of managing our nutrition, you may try to manage your nutrition, but if you are not sleeping well, or if you're staying awake late into the night, then your brain may be confused. It will actually make you that extra hungry to reach for that extra food. So similarly, when it comes to exercise, if it's a very simple example, if we haven't slept well, and if we haven't eaten properly, and if our digestive system hasn't digested our food properly, it will be really hard to hit that treadmill and stay on that treadmill for 60 minutes, or to go for a long run, or to lift weight, or whatever exercise you're doing. So that's why the three foundations of health, that's sleep, nutrition, and physical activity, they're directly or indirectly controlled by the clock. The clock tells us when to sleep and how much to sleep. The clock also makes us to be hungry and to be less hungry at night. It actually controls our appetite and satiety signal. And it also it also primes our body to do better physical activity and gain best for our buck in terms of exercise if we exercise in the late afternoon. So in that way, this combines all these pillars of health that we know of. So when we fix our circadian rhythm, then everything else falls into its right place. It becomes much easier to pay attention to nutrition, activity, and sleep.
Very well said. So all of these things are clearly very much linked and sort of reliant on one another in some capacity. I'm interested in the kind of origin story of your research. So I want to talk about some of the early studies that you did. But what was the kind of science that informed your hypotheses that led to your early research? How long have scientists been thinking about circadian biology and its relation to human health?
Yeah, so the circadian rhythms, the point is we have been living with circadian rhythms for last 200,000 years, ever since human started moving on this planet. But only in the last 50 years, we woke up to its importance because there is a lot of circadian rhythm disruption in our society. And people knew about the bad effect or adverse effect of disrupting our circadian rhythm and sleep for a very long time, actually, because at the beginning of Industrial Revolution, for example, in the UK, women and children were not allowed to do shift work. And one reason was they suspected that shift work might disrupt our body's control mechanism and they may succumb to some disease. In the 20th century, this is, again, circadian rhythm is a field in biomedicine research which is not linked to any disease to begin with. So, for example, cancer research started to cure cancer, heart disease, or cardiology started to treat heart disease. But circadian rhythm actually started as a very basic curiosity about why a body keeps track of time. And what became very clear was as people studied shift work more and more, who do night shift work, day shift work, and they have disrupted sleep, they cannot eat or sleep at the right time, it became very clear that the shift workers are at a very high risk for many chronic disease, starting from obesity, diabetes, to colon cancer, to dementia. But at the same time, it was not clear whether the shift workers who work at night, they also don't have access to healthy diet. They may have other problems. But I think the turning point was when the genomes were sequenced and we started studying how genes function, and people started using modern tools. It became very clear that almost our entire genome turns on and off at different time of the day and night. And second, it also became clear that many genes that are known to cause disease, they also have a circadian rhythm. So that means the genes are primed to do certain things at a certain time, and maybe when they're turning on and off at the wrong time, as in case of circadian rhythm disruption among shift workers, that can cause disease. And people started studying this in controlled condition in laboratory, and they found that that hypothesis is right. Circadian disruption causes disease. Now you might ask, what is circadian rhythm disruption? Is it only for people who do night shift work? So what is now clear is if we think of shift work as a form of circadian rhythm disruption, then what is the definition of that disruption? And it's now defined as staying awake for 2 to 3 hours between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. for 50 days in a year. So that means at least once a week, if someone is staying up late and working on something, then that person is likely to be exposed to a lot of light at night that disrupts our circadian rhythm, and may have to wake up early in the morning to catch up with other societal commitments. And why these 2 hours to 3 hours? Because when we stay awake for 2 to 3 hours one night extra, then it takes us, a body's clock needs 2 to 3 days to catch up to that lost time. So as a result, for half of the week, one may be working against the clock. So now if we use that definition, almost all high school students, all college students, many young adults, almost every new mothers or anyone who is caring for someone else is going through circadian rhythm disruption. And also, we should not forget, nearly 1 in 5 working adults in industrial countries also work in night shift, evening shift, or morning shift, and they're also going through circadian disruption. So that's why almost everybody goes through this kind of disruption. And also, we all can relate that when we don't sleep well or when we eat at the wrong time, then we can feel the consequences right away. It's not a disease, but it is a discomfort. When it continues for many weeks or months, then that can increase our risk for disease.
I was going to ask you about that, about whether it's been assessed, how many people meet that criteria. So I'm glad that you touched on that. So where are we going wrong then? If that many people are suffering from circadian disruption per that definition of being awake for 2 to 3 hours overnight for 50 nights a year, if I heard that correctly, is it artificial light? Is it the timing of our meals, and how has that kind of been established within the field of science looking at this?
Well, I think this is where we have to look at the society and then why people do this. One is at least 20% of people are card-carrying shift workers. So they are the doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, drivers, engineer, airline pilots, and they're essential workers. We call them essential workers, but so we cannot live without them. And as we're going more and more towards a 24 hours on society, then there is pressure on a lot of people to adopt that lifestyle. And when we say someone is working as a shift worker, there is also a lot of second-hand shift work. So, for example, someone's spouse may be staying awake late into the night to give company to somebody's dinner or breakfast or meal, or staying awake to give company just to watch a late night movie. Similarly, children, when they are catching up with and then some of it is institutionalized. So second-hand shift work may account for another 10 to 20% of the population. And then when I say institutionalized, for example, during COVID, as we moved into digital learning, one thing that happened was in many of the digital learning platforms, the deadline for submitting your homework became midnight because that's the end of the day in digital learning platforms. So now, if you look at in many US universities and high schools, the deadline to submit your homework has become midnight instead of 5 p.m. or 3 p.m. that used to be. So now kids are more likely to stay awake, try to finish their homework, so the end of that day has become midnight.
Right.
Then we got to ask another societal need, a personal need. One thing is the reason why we say in the evening we wind down, because in the daytime, whatever we do, that's for our living. Most of us actually don't like the work that we do. So that's why we want to come home, have a nice meal, and then unwind. So that means we want to feel free. We want to be creative, because the cradle of civilization actually started with fireside chat, with that evening thought that's very free for being people who are creative. And we want to do that. We all want to do that. We all want to check news. We want to see the late night show. So as our days become longer and we are spending more time for work, we are also pushing into our sleep. We are spending more time entertaining ourselves, relaxing. So as a result, only in the last maybe 30 to 40 years, almost everybody is feeling this pressure and it has almost become a norm to break your circadian rhythm and do more. And at the same time, we are also seeing that the fraction of people who are suffering from chronic disease is going up. You might think that as we are becoming more modern, our food chain is more secure, we have more safely produced food, and we have a lot of medications, vitamins, supplements, we may be healthier, but we are not. And I would say that partly the circadian rhythm disruption may be something to blame. And unfortunately, this field is so new that there is not much epidemiological study carefully done to see whether that's true or how much is the contribution. But this is where I put my money. I would say yes. This accounts for a lot of increase in the risk factor for chronic disease.
Your point about doing work that we don't, or we potentially don't love or enjoy, is a really interesting one, and the sort of knock-on effect that could have in terms of eating into our sleep. I guess it sort of stresses the importance there about trying to find some sort of occupation or job that we do actually enjoy. I understand that's not always possible, but it's a kind of nice goal. Can we just take one step back? You mentioned the early studies that confirmed, and these were like the sort of experiments that were conducted. I believe most of this was animal research at that stage, that confirmed that circadian disruption can negatively affect health. At a sort of high level, I know that you've conducted studies in that space. What are the sort of most interesting findings that you've seen?
Yeah, so even in humans also, there are some very interesting findings. Of course, we cannot make people stay awake or reduce their sleep for months or years. But what was really interesting to see was when healthy people who have normal blood glucose and not diabetic, if we reduce their sleep by 2 to 3 hours, in the community, some other people who did these experiments, then within a week or two, these healthy adults would develop telltale sign of pre-diabetes. Similarly, circadian disruption by rapidly changing or simulating jet lag kind of experiments in animals without changing how much they eat, or without changing the room temperature, without changing any condition within the vivarium or animal holding rooms, people found that they became more and more susceptible to infectious disease. So the tiny bit of bacteria that usually the body could fight, now the same amount of bacteria could prove lethal for many of the animals. Then the control studies also showed that when animals eat randomly throughout day and night, then experimental tumors grow much more rapidly than when the animals actually eat within a consistent time window every day. And in many cases, even feeding animals within a consistent time window shrunk the tumor. So these are some of the very fascinating studies that connected circadian rhythm disruption or correcting circadian rhythm. What are the kind of health impacts it can have?
I want to come to time-restricted eating and this idea of sort of concentrating your calories within a sort of more restricted number of hours over the day compared to the typical person, and the potential benefits of that and some of the mechanisms that might be at play. Before we do that, just to kind of close the loop while we're talking about just circadian disruption in general and the negative effects of not sleeping as long as we should, what tips would you have for someone with regards to light exposure, given that that's the other sort of main external cue we're talking about here? What are some of the things that you do at home, perhaps, Satchin, or advice that you would give a friend if they asked you this question?
Yeah, so light at night. So there are two aspects to it. When we talk about circadian rhythm, it's always timing matters. So timing can make good light junk or the junk light good. So in that sense, we need bright light during daytime. Everybody needs that. And we should go out and get some daylight. But as the evening rolls in, 2 to 3 hours before we go to bed, our body actually prepares to go to sleep. So even if we are not ready, our body starts the preparation by secreting a little bit more melatonin and cooling us down and reducing our alertness so that we can fall into sleep. But when we get exposed to bright light, when I say bright light, it's 1,000 lux of light. If you want to know what is that light like, if you go to any grocery store these days, almost anywhere in the world, grocery stores and drugstores are very bright these days. So as you walk in, within 15 to 20 minutes, that amount of light can reduce your melatonin level. And one thing is, as we are remodeling our houses, we are putting more and more bright LED light, and that's affecting our circadian rhythm. So the rule of thumb is don't put anything more than 40 watts of light in your living room or in your bedroom. Bedroom can be even dim. And when you are trying to change light switches, even go for the dimming switch so that you can dim down your light. So no bright light, at least for 2 to 3 hours before your bedtime, will help you to go to sleep. And also in our bedroom, there are a lot of electronics that can emit light, the indicators. So if you're sensitive to that, then try to even have a eye mask or sleeping mask handy. So if you cannot control light, then at least get some darkness. And then in the daytime, of course, try to be outside for at least 30 minutes under bright daylight. You don't have to be under sunlight, but even on a cloudy day, being outside for 30 minutes is pretty good to resynchronize our circadian rhythm with the day-night cycle.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if maybe grocery stores and pharmacies, after a certain time, like 6:30, 7 p.m., whether the lights in those stores should potentially change. Should they be a little dimmer later at night?
Well, so that's where I say that the knowledge about light is actually used to keep the shoppers awake and alert so that they can spend more time buying stuff, and also keep their employees awake so that they don't fall asleep at the gas counter.
You're not buying a lot of food if you're asleep. That's a little counterintuitive for their shareholders. But also that makes me think when we're thinking about pharmacies, Satchin, what about if I just decide to hack my way to sleep? And you mentioned melatonin there. Let's say I'm a university student. I'm up all night, lots of bright light, but I buy a melatonin supplement. Can I just do that? And is that a way of being able to stay awake for a long period of time and get the deep rest that I need?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question because you're trying to hack by popping a lot of melatonin when our body actually doesn't produce it. For example, during the daytime. So there are actually conditions in which the body does that naturally, where there is a genetic condition where these patients, they produce a lot of melatonin during daytime and less at night, and as a result, these kids, they stay up all night feeling lonely and have some affective disorder, and then during daytime they're also very sleepy and they're cranky. The trouble with this approach is popping melatonin during daytime is not going to reset your clock. It's just trying to make you sleepy. But at the same time, a body's clock is telling our brain that it's not the time to sleep. So one may not get that restorative sleep. So for example, it's very difficult to be in bed continuously for 6 to 8 hours during the day. And many of us who have tried it, it's very difficult because even if you have gone through an entire night of staying awake, you may sleep for 2 to 3 hours and then you wake up and then it's hard to fall back asleep because the rest of the body is on that clock. So it's not the best idea, but once in a while, if someone is trying, then it may be okay. I must also say that melatonin doesn't only make your brain to sleep, it also has some effect on pancreas clock and our ability to maintain blood glucose level. So during daytime, when we are supposed to eat, having high level of melatonin is not good for glucose control. In fact, our blood glucose level may remain high as if we are pre-diabetic or diabetic.
So probably best for us to just sort of, I guess, stick to the night and day kind of cycle that our ancestors would have had as best as possible, and get out of the way a bit, and our body will take care of things like melatonin and cortisol probably much better than we would through supplementing. Yeah. Let's slide over to time restricted eating. So I'm interested in where this kind of enters this conversation with regards to our circadian biology. How many hours across the day does the average person right now, say in America, eat, and how is this affecting circadian biology?
Yeah, so the concept of eating within a certain hours, it relates to circadian biology in many different ways. One is our digestive system is primed to digest. So the overall idea is, just like our brain can stay awake during daytime, solve complex math, and then wants to sleep at night to repair, reset, and rejuvenate, almost every organ in our body also has a peak time when it can perform much better and needs some downtime to repair, reset, rejuvenate. That's the overarching principle. So now, if we look at every single aspect of our digestive system, when we eat something, it has to be digested in our stomach, and there has to be a lot of acid secretion, and then digestive juice, all the enzymes have to be secreted so that the food gets digested. It takes almost 5 hours to digest a good-sized meal, for example, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So now, let's start our math from the night time. Suppose, say, one eats around, say, 8 o'clock at night, although we finish eating at 8:15, the stomach continues to work for the next 5 hours to digest that food. So that means around 1 o'clock or 1:30 in the morning, that's when the stomach is finally getting some downtime to go to repair, reset, and rejuvenate.
Right.
And our stomach lining needs to repair nearly 7 to 10% of the cells that line the stomach. So there's a good amount of repair that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And then our lower intestine, the food moves in our digestive system because of this peristaltic action, because the muscles contract and expand. So that's how they move when the food moves. But that action also slows down and also almost stops because the intestine needs to sleep. So as a result, the food actually doesn't move much. So some of us who, when we eat late at night, next day we feel like the food is not digested. And it's not just a feeling. Actually, the food doesn't get digested properly because the peristaltic movement stops. So now, if we think that your stomach, just like our brain, needs 7 to 8 hours of downtime to repair. So that means if you eat at 8 o'clock and if your stomach gets a break at 1 o'clock in the morning, for the next 7 to 8 hours, it needs that downtime so that it can repair itself. Then one should not eat until at least 9 o'clock in the morning next day. So that's the simple math, just from the stomach point of view. And there are many other aspects of our digestion, nutrient assimilation, that essentially tell us that we should be eating for no more than 12 hours in a day, because we need that 5 hours of digestion after the last meal and then 7 to 8 hours of repair and rejuvenation to be ready for the next day.
Mm. And how long is the average person currently eating over? What's a typical eating window if you were just to go and grab the average American?
Yeah, so another point is we don't eat the same at the exact same time every day. So, for example, I'll give you an example and you can actually give me the answer. I'll give you some example and then ask you a question. So, for example, suppose say today I eat my breakfast at 6 in the morning, tomorrow it will be 6:15, day after tomorrow it's 5:45, another day maybe 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock. And if somebody asks you, hey Simon, when does Sachin actually typically eats breakfast, or when does his circadian system expects to eat food, then the answer will be around 6 o'clock. Because one day maybe I ate at 5:45, but usually around 6 o'clock, 6:15, 6:30. So now, if we do the same math and then take 2 weeks of food data from somebody and then ask what is the probable time window in which this person is likely to eat 90+% of its meal, then the number that we get is 14 hours, 45 minutes. So nearly half of the adults in the US who are not doing shift work, because for shift workers it's even worse, nearly 50% of adults eat for 14 hours, 45 minutes or longer. Less than 10% of people actually eat consistently within 12 hours or less. So that means there is room for improvement for almost all of us to improve our health just by paying attention to when we eat or when we stop eating.
Right. And you said it takes about 5 hours to sort of digest the last meal that you have at the end of the day. And then after that, you need about 7 to 8 hours to kind of get that repair process happening. Can you just define a little bit deeper what repair means? Is this where things like autophagy I often see sort of brought into this conversation? Is this where processes like that sort of come in?
Yeah, so there are many types of repair. So let's start with the gut, because during the day we eat a lot of different stuff, and then there is also enzymes and acids that are secreted, and we damage nearly 8 to 10% of our stomach lining. And you can think of this as your highway or the road, or you can think of the cobblestone road where you take out 8 to 10% of the stones every day, and they have to be repaired. They have to be physically replaced. And the way that happens is growth hormone from our pineal gland is secreted, and actually the secretion goes up with two signals. One is fasting, and second is our deep sleep. So if we haven't eaten for several hours, and if we're in our deep sleep, then the growth hormone is secreted. That gives a signal to the stomach lining to divide and replace these damaged cells or dead cells. And this is a very relatable repair process that we can think of. And similarly, in the brain, when we sleep, then many of our toxins, brain toxins, they do get secreted into the outside of the cell. It's almost like taking the trash can out and leaving it outside for the truck to come and pick it up. So that also happens. So that's like taking the toxin literally out of the body. And you also mentioned autophagy, and autophagy also occurs after several hours of fasting. So that's internal, almost like recycling process within the cell. So all three types of repair, where you are recycling within the cell, taking the trash outside the cell, and even replacing the entire cell when it is damaged. All these three types of repairs happen during our fasting plus sleep time.
And so you said we should aim for at least 12 hours of period without
fasting.
food, right?
Yeah.
So what would you, if we were to kind of just at this point, before we keep going, if we were to kind of define what you think is the optimal eating window and sort of translate that into what that looks like in the standard person's daily life, so not a shift worker, just a standard person, what would that look like in terms of the time that someone, say, wakes up, their breakfast, lunch, dinner, and bedtime?
Yeah, so let's start with the bedtime, because your next day actually begins with when you go to bed. So try to be consistent in going to bed, and then try to be in bed for 8 hours so that you can get 7 hours of sleep. And then after waking up, one should wait for at least an hour or two before eating anything with calories, because that's the time when our sleep hormone melatonin goes down, cortisol rapidly rises and reaches its peak and then slowly adjusts itself. And our insulin function, our insulin secretion is adversely affected by both processes, by melatonin as well as high level of cortisol. So that's why one should avoid food for 1 to 2 hours in the morning. And then have your breakfast at a consistent time, because since our clocks get synchronized with each other and with the outside world by two signals, light and food, and actually over the last 5 to 10 years, what we are seeing is food is a much more stronger signal for all our peripheral organs than light. Light is a very good signal for brain, but food is very strong for the rest of our body. So, so eat your breakfast, the first meal that has calories at a consistent time, and then try to eat all your meals in the next 8, 10, or maximum 12 hours. And in most of our clinical studies, we target 10 hours because 8 hours is a little bit difficult for long-term compliance. If somebody can do 8 hours for a month, 2 or 3, that's fine. But many of us cannot do it for our rest of our life. So it's a good goal to have 10 hours, so that once in a while you can eat within 8 hours, and once in a while if you cannot and go towards 11 or 12, you are not actually breaking, not doing too much damage. So that's why 10 hours is an ideal target.
So an example of that could be 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. That might work well.
7. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a couple questions on a few things there. So one that comes up, and a lot of people sent me this, Satchin, was, okay, within that fasting period in the morning, before you have that first meal, would things like supplements or medications or tea, coffee, let's say black coffee, would they be permitted within that? I mean, no one's watching, but I'm thinking from a biological point of view. Are they going to interrupt these biological repair mechanisms that you mentioned, or would they be okay to have in that fasting period?
So again, this is a question that we cannot do any clinical trial or systematic study, even in animals. We cannot feed animal coffee every day before we give them milk. But this is where we got to use some common sense and arrive at. So there are many medications that need to be taken with empty stomach. So people should continue to take those in empty stomach. Best example is thyroid medication. People who are taking levothyroxine, that should be taken in empty stomach in the morning. So that's fine.
Sure.
Where it kind of becomes gray zone is coffee with a little bit of, people will say, I just put half a teaspoon of sugar or a little bit of cream just to make it palatable. And one thing is, it relates to what is your goal. If your goal is to lose weight or maintain your blood glucose level, then maybe a mild coffee or tea is okay. So that's why we say there are 3 exceptions to the rule. One is if your job depends on it. For example, there are a lot of shift workers. They have to wake up early in the morning. They have the morning shift. They have to be fully alert. And for them, tea or coffee is kind of having a job or no job. For example, if you're a TV presenter, you have to be awake. Second is for public safety. You should not be driving on the road sleepy. It's better to be a little bit caffeinated. And then the third one is if you really cannot function without coffee, that's the only love in your life, then you can have it. But here is the thing, how it affects. So there are a lot of people who cannot drink strong coffee or tea for long term in empty stomach because that can lead to acid reflux or even panic or anxiety attack because the body cannot tolerate the strong coffee. So if you're one of them, then try to see whether you can reduce your caffeine dose or if you can delay that for an hour or 2 and have it after breakfast. In fact, in Turkey, the literal meaning of breakfast means the meal before coffee, because a lot of people can have acid reflux in empty stomach. Now let's come back to the physiology and see what is breaking a fast or what affects your body so that your insulin production and everything else begins to start. So if you take me and drain all of my blood and figure out how much blood sugar I have, then the official blood sugar level for somebody healthy is it should be less than 100 milligram per 100 milliliter. So that means if you find 5 liters of blood, that is the average blood that you'll find from a person like me, then I have 5 grams of sugar in my blood. And if it goes to 6 grams, then it'll be 120 milligram per 100 ml, and you diagnose me as pre-diabetic. And if I have 7 grams, then I'm diabetic because my fasting blood glucose will be 140. So that means if you add just 2 grams of sugar, half a teaspoon of sugar to your coffee or tea, that can raise your blood sugar to 140 milligram per 100 ml. That means at that time, your pancreas will begin to kick in and produce that insulin to take care of your blood sugar. So you are essentially waking up your stomach, your liver, your pancreas, and whole body. So that's why if you do the math and then think of what actually happens, then it makes sense to understand that even that tea or coffee with half a teaspoon of sugar or a little bit of cream is breaking your fast.
What about if it's just a black coffee, Satchin? I just want to dig a little deeper here. Let's just say I love to be honest, my morning coffee, I don't always have a double espresso. Sometimes I have a macchiato. There's a little bit of oat milk or something in there. So I understand that's probably going to throw you out of a fast. But let's just say it's a double espresso. What do you think about that? Are we including that or are we taking that out?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, the thing is, you are a very healthy, fit person. And a lot of us who are thinking about this black coffee thing, we are really healthy and fit. I'm talking about people who really need the fasting and they just cannot live. They think there are a lot of people who think that, hey, having tea with if you're in the UK or in India and in many parts of the world, they will think that having a cup of tea with biscuit is not breaking my fast. In fact, when we interview people, when is your breakfast time? People will say, eat at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning. And then if we ask, well, after you wake up, what do you eat or drink? Then they'll say that I have a cup of tea with milk and with biscuit or something. So we're talking about those people. And they have to kind of understand what is breaking the fast. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of us, having a double espresso is actually not kicking our pancreas to high gear to produce insulin. And that, as I said, it may not break our fast. We may continue our fast.
I want to come to blood glucose and how time-restricted eating can be affecting various aspects of our health, particularly if we have sort of metabolic dysfunction or poor metabolic health. But while we're talking about healthy folks here, if someone is, let's say, lean, from a physiological point of view, all of their kind of biomarkers or risk factors are under control, is there a benefit from eating within a shortened window? Would they be getting any benefit from time-restricted eating at all?
Yeah, so there are a lot of people who complain about their sleep. So what we are seeing is both in animal studies and human studies, people who do 8 to 10 hours time-restricted eating, the first thing they mention is they sleep much better. And we don't understand the mechanism, but we are seeing that the sleep improves. Another thing that we also see is a lot of people who believe they're healthy, they don't have any metabolic syndrome, they don't have any metabolic disease. They might have acid reflux, they might have bloating, might have indigestion once in a while. And that reduces their productivity. And what we are also seeing is all of these digestive issues become much better. So, for example, personally, I used to have acid reflux, and many acid reflux medications would be by my bedside, and I would lose sleep sometimes. And after I started time restricting 10, 12 years ago, I haven't gone to, I haven't bought any new acid reflux meds, and I haven't used them. So this is one example where people actually will benefit. And second, and another thing is, in long term, we all are healthy. We may be all healthy now, but if you think of what is our health goal, I used to say that if you can be healthy and without medication till your kids go to college or until you hit 50, that's actually a lofty goal. And you cannot do that unless you start planning very early. So time restricted eating is almost like preparing for your retirement savings. It starts
Right.
the day you start working. From that day you start saving. So similarly, to add those extra decades of healthy life, people who are healthy, they should actually start doing this.
Yeah, when you break it down that way, it makes my question look a little silly, because it would be like saying, should we eat a healthy diet today if we're otherwise healthy, or should we just wait until we have disease and then think about it? So I think you answered that well. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about blood glucose, because you've mentioned that a few times, and a staggeringly high number of people have type 2 diabetes. There are many people with pre-diabetes. I'm interested in how time-restricted eating can be utilized as a tool to help better blood glucose control. So what's the kind of relationship between the time of the day, our meal, and blood glucose control? And as an extension of that, perhaps you could speak to something that Emily and Courtney also spoke to, which is this idea of early time-restricted eating versus late time-restricted eating when it comes to blood glucose control. And if someone has pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, what are some of the things that they should be thinking about here?
Yeah, so that's a very loaded question. So I'll break it down. So, when we think of circadian rhythm, we always think of connecting it to sleep, but actually circadian rhythms are much more intimately related to blood glucose, the regulation of blood glucose, cholesterol, and fat. And let's begin with what happens, how all of these are connected. And this is very important because, as you mentioned, nearly half of the adults in Western countries, particularly in the US, UK, Australia, are either pre-diabetic or diabetic, type 2 diabetic. And this trend is also going up. So that means what we are doing as a society is something is very fundamentally wrong. And that may be this eating randomly over a long period of time. So as I said, in the morning, for example, as soon as we wake up, if we eat, then at that time, our pancreas is not ready to assimilate food in a way that our blood glucose remains healthy. One thing we have to keep in mind that we always say some diet is rich in protein, diet is rich in fat, but the bottom line is almost all food that we eat has some carbohydrate, unless you are just eating pure oil or pure meat. But for most of us, it contains some carbohydrates. So that's why avoiding meal for at least an hour or two in the morning will help in preparing our body, particularly our pancreas, to respond to that carbohydrate in a healthy way in the morning. And the second is circadian rhythm research is also showing that the pancreas is much better in responding to food and secreting good amount of insulin to control our blood glucose, say 2 hours after waking up for the next 6 to 7 hours or 8 hours. So that means eating a good big meal in the first half of the day is much better in controlling blood glucose because our digestive system and pancreas are better in handling big meal.
I think that's a really important point. Sorry, Satchin, just to reiterate something there. Given the number of people with poor blood glucose control that could benefit from this as a tool, I think this is worth kind of double clicking on, because if you think about, say, intermittent fasting or the standard sort of 8-hour protocol that became very popular, I know in speaking to a lot of people that many people did a sort of midday to 8 p.m. style eating window. But from what you're saying, if you're wanting to get improvements in blood glucose control, and if that's something that you're struggling with, it might be more beneficial to kickstart that eating window slightly earlier than that.
Yeah, but not too early that right after you wake up, you should start eating. So have like 2 hours wait time after waking up, and then try to eat around 9 or 10 in the morning if you can, or if you're waking up too early, maybe even 8 o'clock is okay. Then there's another aspect that we often forget is, okay, so let's work on the end of the day. So what happens is, for most of us, our body begins to prepare for sleep by producing melatonin 2 to 3 hours before our bedtime. So that means if I'm going to bed around, say, habitually around 10 o'clock at night, then my body starts making melatonin at 8 in the evening. So melatonin, for nearly half of the population, melatonin actually inhibits insulin release from pancreas. So that means if I have my dinner at 7 o'clock and my blood glucose is still high, my pancreas is kicking to produce enough insulin to bring that blood glucose low, then melatonin comes in and inhibits that process so that my blood glucose can stay high for several minutes or even an hour or two longer. So that's why having your last meal at least 3 hours before bedtime is a pretty good idea, so that your body can kind of use that glucose without raising blood glucose too high.
Would that mean, Satchin, sort of continuing that train of thought there, would that therefore mean if you're a shift worker and you are eating overnight, that it would be better through that shift to be around bright light so that you don't get that increase in melatonin as you're then eating those meals?
Yeah, so if you're a shift worker and and your shift is ending, say, 7 or 8 in the morning, and you're coming back home at 9, so then your last meal should be say around 4 to 6 o'clock in the morning, so that you give yourself 3 to 4 hours, come back and have a nice dark room where you can sleep. And as you said, enough light so that melatonin remains low.
Okay. And when we're thinking about these sort of benefits with regards to blood glucose control, or just big picture here, I think this idea of meal timing versus calorie restriction, inevitably it comes up a lot, and I'm sure this is a conversation you've had many, many, many times. And I know that Courtney Peterson's work, and she explained on our episode, showed improvements in blood glucose control that were independent of weight loss, which was really interesting. Yeah, which sort of suggests that, at least in that study, those subjects had improvements in blood glucose control independent of actually losing weight. So this kind of, I want to zoom in here a little bit on time-restricted eating versus calorie restriction. And I think the first question that I'd like to kind of throw at you, which is often overlooked, is as I understand it, time-restricted eating naturally leads to calorie restriction. And if I'm right there, I'm wondering, so in your studies, when you, or in your colleagues' studies, when you get humans to eat within a 10-hour eating window, what happens to calorie intake? How much, if at all, does it kind of fall by on average?
Yeah, so there are two parts. One is in the laboratory condition. When we do all the animal studies, we keep the calories constant. So the animals eat the same number of calories, whether they're eating randomly at random time or within time-restricted eating. So that's why the term time-restricted eating was coined, because the calorie was not restricted, time was restricted.
Right.
When it comes to humans, since we all overeat. We are eating more calories than we need. And mostly we eat more calories that we need by eating over a long period of time. It's not that we are squeezing all that calories into 6 hours and eating a 3,000 kilocal meal. We actually eat extra because we eat late into the night, or we eat too early in the morning, or both. So as a result, when we reduce our eating window, then there are a few things happen. One is people report that, particularly when you eat within 8 to 10 hours, people actually feel less hungry. So they are not craving for that food. So as a result, they eat less and they can reduce their caloric intake. And many studies where this time-restricted eating is being tested, in those studies, people are overweight or obese. So that means for lifelong, they were eating more than what their body needs. And when you reduce that time window, then inadvertently they reduce their caloric intake by 10 to 20%. In some studies, 10%, in some studies, 20%. And on an average, this is the group average, 10 to 20% reduction. And then at the same time, you see all these improvement in glucose, blood pressure, and everything else. So people always assume that the effect of time restriction is mostly through caloric restriction. But as Courtney pointed out, and in many studies, if we look at individuals, then we do see individuals who are not reducing their calories, but they still see benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is another aspect of this, that is, not all diabetics are overweight or obese. Nearly 1/3 of pre-diabetic and type 2 diabetics are actually within healthy weight range, and they're still, they cannot control their blood glucose level. And for them, the advice is not to reduce calories because they already have normal weight. And if they reduce too much, then they may become dangerously underweight. So then the question is, for normal weight people with pre-diabetes or diabetes, is intentional caloric restriction or time restriction, which one is going to work? And no one has done that study, so that would be an important study to do to see whether these effects are there. One thing that we are also forgetting, that diabetes doesn't come alone. It has its sinister friends. And I kind of in the last book, in Circadian Diabetes Score, I described that. Many diabetic patients with diabetes also have hypertension or high blood pressure. Many of them also have high cholesterol. They may be taking statins to control their cholesterol. And we know that nearly a good proportion of people who take statins, they cannot tolerate it because they have muscle pain. And then the question is, can time restriction help to help for these people who are already having telltale sign of pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, have hypertension, have high cholesterol, and they're on what we call polypharmacy. They're already taking more than two or more medications. And can time restricted eating help? Because these guys have already gone through trying to do caloric restriction, because the first line of lifestyle intervention, any physician will say, is eat less and move more. And they failed that. And in our study, what we're finding is, yes, these people, a lot of them can actually adopt time restriction. And when they do that, then their blood pressure regulation is much better. They can, whether they are on medication or not on medication, they always see improvement in both systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. And then
But what you just said is really, really important and worth emphasizing, that for some people, counting calories hasn't worked. And it's actually, I see it as a nice, we're in a nice position to have multiple tools here. And I think I've heard you say before that people often have great difficulty counting calories, but counting time is much easier, if I recall correctly. I think that's a quote I heard from you.
Yeah. So, for example, between you and I cannot count and tell you how many calories I have eaten today. But I can tell you exactly when I had my breakfast and even my lunch and snacks. So we are much better because we are designed to count time. So we can count it. So these are some of the examples where it's not only controlling blood glucose, but with blood glucose misregulation, there are many other diseases that come with it, and time restriction can help manage those conditions. And also, I must say that counting calories is important, particularly when someone is eating say 4,000 kilocal, and there are a good chunk of population who actually overeat. They eat more than 2,500 kilocal, more than 25-30% of what they need, and sometimes those extra calories are actually consumed late into the night or at random times. So time restriction actually can be a way to manage or to improve caloric restriction.
Right.
So that's a new approach that even card-carrying researchers who do caloric restriction studies, they are coming to this understanding or coming to accept that time restriction can be in that toolbox to help people reduce calories.
So tell me, with regards to kind of looking forward, future research, I think it's you've made it clear here that time restricted eating can certainly help someone reduce calories, and there will be some benefit through that, absolutely, and that can be a great thing for someone who's struggled counting calories. I don't think anyone's debating that. You're also saying that your position is that there's some independent effects of restricting your eating window, independent of weight loss. And my question that I kind of would throw to you here is, given that there is debate out there that I'm sure you're aware of, what kind of study would it take, or is there a study that you're excited by that would see time restricted eating potentially end up, let's say, in dietary or in lifestyle guidelines?
I think it's already in lifestyle guideline. I mean, the American Heart Association put a position statement several years ago saying periodic fasting or overnight fasting is good. And even the caloric restriction researchers would accept the idea that one should not wake up in the middle of the night to eat a small amount of calories. So that means everybody accepts the fact that, yes, we should not eat for at least 7 to 8 hours when we're in bed. And nutrition scientists and gastroenterologists will also say that one should not eat 1 to 2 hours before going to bed because your core body temperature is high, you cannot sleep well, you cannot digest well food. So the bottom line is people accept the fact that one should fast or one should not eat for at least 10 to 12 hours a day. Then the other question is, okay, so should people eat within 10 hours or should people just eat within that 12 to 13 hours and reduce calorie? And I think this is where the benefit is so little, or the difference will be so little, that you need to have a very large cohort clinical trial and also pick the right type of target population who can do this. The question is that worth it, or should we do it in animal studies? Because in animals we can control many of this. And in fact, one of the best animal studies addressing this was just published a few weeks ago, and I wrote a editorial in Science, a preview in Science about it. And the experiment is very simple. People know for almost now 90 years that rodents, whether it's rats or mice, if you reduce their caloric intake by 10 to 20%, then mice live longer or rats live longer. And that's the foundation for proposing caloric restriction to increase lifespan. So now, few years ago, almost 6-7 years ago, scientists also figured out that the way the animal experiments are done, the caloric restriction studies are done, they were inadvertently doing time restriction, because the control mice would be given, say, 10 grams of food or X amount of food, and that's they consume throughout day and night because food is in the food hopper. They have access to food all the time. And then the researchers would come back and calculate how much food the mouse ate, and they would put 70% or 80% of that diet in one meal at one time in the late afternoon or evening. And then mice would eat that within 2 to 4 hours. And then for the rest 20 hours, they were fasting. So practically, they were doing both caloric restriction and time restriction at the same time. So then the question was whether how much of that lifespan extension was due to calorie restriction and how much was due to time restriction. So that became very clear that this is an important question to ask. So the experiment was not very easy to do because you had to design a lot of engineering tools to feed mice tiny amount of food throughout day and night. So these researchers, they brought mice and then divided them into many different groups. One group got to eat whenever they wanted, and they figured out how much they lived. They reduced the calories and then fed them in, I think, 9 or 10 equal meals throughout 24 hours. So they didn't have any time restriction, but they have caloric restriction. And by doing this, they found that these mice lived 10% longer. So that's very clear that by caloric restriction, you can make mice live 10% longer. And there was no time restriction because in every 3 hours, these mice were eating something. Now they said, okay, so instead of feeding them in every 3 hours, if we feed them in every 80 minutes or 90 minutes and give them the same amount of food, either during the day, 12 hours, or the night, 12 hours, then what happens? Or if we feed them in day 2 hours and night 2 hours, then what happens? What they found was when the mice ate within 12 hours, during the day, when they're even not supposed to eat, then they lived 20% longer. So that means time restriction alone, without aligning to the right time, even extended their lifespan another 10%. So now they ask, okay, so what happens if the mice are given the same amount of food, but at nighttime, because mice are nocturnal, their circadian rhythm is designed so that they have to eat at night. And when they fed them at night time, they found that the mice lived 35% longer. So now imagine, caloric restriction alone extends lifespan by 10%. Any kind of time restriction, day or night, can extend lifespan another 10%. And if you align the time restriction to the right time of the circadian cycle, then you can gain another 15% benefit.
Right.
So that experiment, I think, nicely answered this question that in animals, at least, this kind of lifespan extension happens. Now, if you circle back and ask, what happens in human experiment and what did they find in mice? One interesting thing was they found all these mice that had caloric restriction, whether at daytime, nighttime, or throughout 24 hours, they had the same exact body weight. They all lost weight. They had the same exact muscle mass, the same exact fat mass, and this very similar level of insulin. So that means your weight loss, your muscle mass, your fat loss, all of this that result from time restriction or caloric restriction is not going to predict what is going to happen to lifespan, what is going to protect you from disease. So that remained unanswered. So the answer is yes, we cannot just look at weight loss as an outcome in human studies in caloric restriction or time restriction and say, hey, there is no contribution of time restriction.
Right.
So fortunately, the experiment is done in animals, but we don't know what to measure in human to compare the benefit of time restriction plus calorie restriction versus calorie restriction alone.
That was my question. So short of kind of running a trial for many, many decades, what would be a biomarker or something that you could measure to say, hey, look, TRE is affecting this marker, which we know is predictive of longevity, but calorie restriction is not. And it gets me thinking, if we circle back, there was a word that we spoke about before, autophagy, and that often comes up in this conversation. And one of the questions that I was sent from people in the community was, autophagy seems a little bit abstract. Is it actually something that you can, if you take a peek under the hood, can you objectively measure it?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. And also, we should not think that autophagy is always good, because in fact, in cancer, we have to stop autophagy. We have to reduce autophagy, because cancer cells do excessive autophagy to recycle and grow. So I think the point is we can just use common sense. If we take, our body essentially is a function of 10 or 12 critical organs that function. If we measure all these functions, bone mineral density, for example, for bones, muscle mass, muscle strength, then lung function, liver function, adrenal function, reproductive function, all of this, and then come up with a massive questionnaire and measurement tools. Then we can ask, okay, those are the health outcomes. Then a participant burden. Whatever you do, at the end of the day, if the participant has to work a lot to figure out what he or she has to do, then that particular lifestyle is not going to be scalable at a population health level. So that's the second aspect. And then the third aspect is the economy of scale. How much time and how much energy, how much resources are to be spent to make one person stick to that lifestyle. We know that, for example, diabetes prevention program, which emphasizes on reducing calories, eating better food, and doing more exercise, that has a price tag. And, depending on the technology, it has gone from $4,000 a year to $1,400 a year. So similarly, we have to come up with a price tag. How much it takes to educate an average Joe what is time-restricted eating and what is sensibly this person can do. So if you take health, biomarkers, or outcomes, then participant burden, and then the financial cost to the society or to the person, then we ask, okay, so what can we do to improve health, whether calorie restriction alone, time restriction alone, or a combination of even three: time restriction, calorie restriction with better diet. And I think that would be the answer. Optimum diet, just enough calories within an optimum time window. But I guess what will happen is some people can adopt 1, 2, or 3, and the responsibility of scientists and clinicians is to give these options and make sure that these options, each individual or the combination of 2 or 3, can benefit a person.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at this, because it often feels like one threatens the other with regards to researchers working on different areas, or just people in the public that are sort of passionate about one of these. And I get it. Someone has a personal anecdote. Let's say, for example, they did a shortened window and they lost 50 pounds, and then the next person counted their calories and lost 50 pounds. And they're both equally as passionate about those being the kind of best tools. But I think it's a really interesting proposition to think about. I would hypothesize that if you could improve diet quality and get people eating over less hours, that calories would be significantly lower per day on average. I want to come back to the protocol a little bit more, because we spoke about that 10-hour window, sort of 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. being something that might be achievable for many people. Recently, I heard a colleague of yours, I think you've published a few papers with him, Dr. Longo, express his kind of thoughts about fasting for more than 12 hours. And he didn't seem to be a big fan of that. And a 10-hour eating window, I guess, is a 14-hour fast. And there are probably people listening here that have heard Dr. Longo sort of expressed his opinion on that, and I wondered sort of where you land there.
What did he say?
Well, I think he said that he doesn't think for longevity it's optimal to be fasting for more than 12 hours a day.
Is there any data? And the question.
Yeah, well, that wasn't shared, so I think that's a great question.
So but one has to be objective. A lot of people have their opinion, and I cannot address just somebody's opinion, because if there is scientific fact, then I can go back and see whether the point is almost every animal studies that did caloric restriction, even his own early caloric restriction studies, they actually fed the animals for less than 6 hours. And all of them lived longer than mice that ate healthy diet for longer than 12 hours.
Okay.
So if there's thousands of caloric restriction studies, it's not one or two, it's literally thousands, because this has been going on for 90 years. If they have shown again and again and again that feeding mice for less than 12 hours in multiple labs, in male and female, in multiple strains, in mice, in rats, and even in monkeys, if they're not adversely affecting health, then there is no point to discuss this based on one opinion.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I could rephrase that. You're in, and you've already made it clear, but what you're saying is you think a 10-hour, there's no reason to think a 10-hour eating window is not safe, would be a better way for me to kind of position that.
And also another thing is there was a study done in Europe where they tried 12 hours time restricted eating, and it did not improve any health indices for people who were unhealthy. So the experiment has already been done, and it doesn't improve health.
One question that comes up here a little bit is how much of this research has been done on females and different ages, different life stages. I know there's this is an opinion that I've seen out there and has been shared with me by a lot of people. So I'm not getting you to comment on the opinion so much, but more your sort of feel for the evidence that exists out there and where you land. But there is a doctor that has been sharing information online stating that the TRE studies haven't really included many women sort of aged 40 and over, I believe, and that she doesn't believe that time-restricted eating is kind of healthy for women of that age. How do you sort of feel about that?
Again, that's an opinion, and it's good that we have to include more women in studies, and we got to see whether they will benefit or not. But the animal studies have again shown that both young, middle-aged, and also a little bit older female animals still benefit from time-restricted eating. And in fact, in animals, time-restricted eating extended their reproductive lifespan. So that means these animals were still ovulating at an older age when the ad-lib-fed mice have stopped ovulating. And then in our studies, what we have found is female mice who were eating within 9 hours, they were completely protected from endotoxin shocks, which is similar to bacterial infection. So in our study, what we found is male mice that were ad libitum fed, more than half of them died when they're challenged with endotoxin shock, and nearly 1/3 died when they did time-restricted eating. The female mice, on the other hand, all 100% of them were completely protected. None of them died if they had done time-restricted eating. So that's again another example. Means people always, people are stuck with this idea, their personal opinion and their conviction, and the thing that, okay, women cannot lose weight, older women, and it will not help. Well, the thing is, people have to be a little bit open-minded. And then, it's a good question to ask that, yes, there should be more women in clinical trials. And in fact, there are in many of our studies also, we have included women, but I must say that the number is not large enough to do statistical analysis on individual gender and then figure out whether it's good or bad. What we have seen is many women, they want to try all at the same time. And they also want to get most out of it. So then what they end up doing, they'll try to do 4 to 6 hours of time-restricted eating. So they are fasting for 20 to 18 hours. They want to reduce calories significantly. So the only thing they eat is salad and a few other nuts or something. At the same time, they want to run a marathon. And then what ends up happening is they are more likely to become amenorrheic, and more likely to have low bone mineral density and brittle bones. And that's what happens. And it's actually, there is a syndrome called relative energy deficit in sports.
Right.
And REDS is more prevalent among women, but also there are many men who succumb to REDS. So we have to keep that in mind, that maybe some people took it to too extreme, and they are the ones who might have suffered. And it's always those few anecdata that complicate the field.
You mentioned there the kind of mice studies that have had male and females, and I think some people might be thinking about the kind of reliability of translating findings in that research to human research. And I know that you're a big proponent of multiple lines of evidence, but just with regards to circadian biology and thinking about hours, is the circadian clock in a mouse, because I think we kind of glossed over this, but is it similar? Is it a 24-hour clock, and thus those eating windows in those experiments are quite easy to kind of translate to human eating windows as well?
Yeah, the clocks are very similar, and in fact, most of the clock genes and the mechanisms are identical or well conserved between mouse and humans. Metabolism, we all know that there is some differences. So, for example, 14 hours fasting in mice maybe a little bit should be equivalent to more longer fasting if we just think about if you're thinking only about glycogen depletion or fat oxidation. But many circadian based parameters. So for example, when I say gut repair, or there is a time window within which the gut has to repair, or there's a time window in which the insulin producing cells are more active, all of those mechanisms are very similar between human and mouse. So that's why we have to keep that in mind, that, well, there are some aspects of metabolism, those are different, but when it comes to repair, rejuvenation, reset, those are very similar. I'll give you an example. How much do you think a mouse, little mouse that is 30 grams, that weighs 30 grams, runs every night? How many meters or kilometers you would think?
Oh gosh, a little mouse. I'm gonna guess 1.5 kilometers.
A mouse can run somewhere between 7 to 12 kilometers every night.
Gosh.
So that means I should run between here and San Francisco every night if I extrapolate that. But that doesn't extrapolate that way linearly. Many things don't extrapolate linearly. So in that sense, yes, as the animals are smaller and smaller, they actually have different metabolism. Just think of the hummingbird, how much it has to fly to get tiny nectar. So in that way, there are differences. But when it comes to circadian rhythm or circadian related stuff, then there are similarities. In fact, a few years ago, we did a very simple experiment. We asked, does the benefit of time-restricted eating depend on circadian clock, which is a very counterintuitive experiment to do from my lab, because we always think of circadian rhythm. But what we found is, yes, it does actually benefit even mice that don't have circadian clock because of genetic defect. And the reason is this, why we did this experiment. There are many genetic models of mice and laboratory animals that also succumb to similar metabolic disease as humans do. And as genetic testing is becoming more and more widespread, we often blame it on our gene. We say, hey, I'm diabetic because it runs in my family. I cannot help it. But actually, the point is, if you have a faulty gene, then you can adopt good lifestyle to reduce the adverse effect of that faulty gene. And this is very important when it comes to a healthy lifestyle. The healthy lifestyles are actually something that we can do to address our faulty gene, because we cannot change our genes, but we can change our lifestyle. And when we change our lifestyle, we can significantly reduce the risk for many diseases. So that's why we did the experiment. But the bottom line is, yes, even time-restricted eating can override faulty genes that make mice obese, diabetic, or even have cardiovascular disease.
Repair, rejuvenate, reset has come up a few times here. And something that I think people might be thinking about is, the longer that I'm fasting, do I get more compounding benefits with regards to repair, rejuvenation and resetting the system, so to speak. And online you'll see people posting about doing 24-hour water fasts. You'll see people talking about 3-day water fasts. I'm interested in sort of hearing from you. Is the longer the better, or is there a kind of sweet spot where you kind of maximize benefits and beyond that it could even be deleterious?
I think this is where I want to bring dental care into picture. So, for example, if brushing your teeth once a day is like 12 hours time restricted eating, and brushing your teeth twice is like 10 hours time restricted eating, and flossing and brushing is 8 hours time restricted eating, and then going to your dentist once in every 6 months is kind of doing water fasting once in a while. Are you going to go to your dentist every week? Will that improve your dental health to get your teeth really scrubbed and drilled? No. I mean, this is exactly where we have to do some common sense. The reason is, this is where we can also go talk about REDS, because REDS is actually an extreme form of being super conscious about your health, where people exercise more, eat less, and then they also develop many psychiatric and affective disorders and neuroendocrine disorders. So I guess anyone from 10-year-old to 100-year-old can eat within 12 hours. And a lot of us can try to eat within 10 hours, so that at least for half of the days or 5 days in a week, we can eat within 10 hours, which is like brushing your teeth twice a day. And then if you want, maybe once in a while, it's a good idea to do even like Walter Longo's fasting mimicking diet, 4 or 5 days of very low calorie diet once in a while, or water fasting for 24 hours. So the idea is there are many different ways of fasting. One thing is, we have to think about a lifestyle. Lifestyle is what, when, and how much we eat, sleep, and exercise every single day. And lifestyle is very different from intervention. Intervention is when you do something for a few days and then go back to your lifestyle. So that's why your lifestyle should be, say, 10 hours target. And once in a while, if you want to do some intervention to, for example, if you want to reduce your inflammation because your joints are swollen and you cannot function well when you climb stairs, you have pain, then maybe pay attention to your sleep. Try to get 8 to 9 hours of sleep for a week. Around the same time, try some longer fast, and that may help.
Very sound advice. Coming to the end here, I'm interested in your thoughts on lifespan in humans. I've heard you speak about the potential benefit of time-restricted eating, reducing the kind of incidence of cancer and CVD, the top two killers. So I'm just kind of interested in big picture here, how you see this sort of affecting public health and lifespan.
And the biggest challenge now is how to reduce the burden of chronic disease. Because if we think of if you ask a 50-year-old, like, I went to my daughter's graduation from high school and I looked around to see how many parents are there who are approaching 50 or above 50, around 50, and they look healthy. And it was very depressing to see that. So now we know that nearly 50% of adults have pre-diabetes or diabetes, 50% are hypertensive, and 1 in 3 have fatty liver disease that will progress towards NAS or even liver cancer at one point. There are nearly 80 million prescriptions written for acid reflux and heartburn, and there are millions more who just consume over-the-counter medication. So I think those are the things that we have to tackle first, because you cannot, it's just asking, is your car going to run till the moon, so which is 250,000 miles? If you don't change the tire, if you don't change the oil at the regular time. So I think time-restricted eating should help to reduce the burden of chronic disease that affect almost all of us. That's the first goal. And then the second is, which we still don't understand, means we talk about longevity a lot. But in reality, many of even the laboratory experiments are not done on older mice or older animals. Let's accept it. For the first time in human history, we are living more number of years if we use females as a yardstick, as a benchmark. Women are living more number of years in the post-menopausal state than in the reproductive years. And we don't have even enough research to say what will keep a mouse healthy in that old age. So I guess people who say that we can do this to keep humans live for more than 100 years with one healthy lifestyle, that may be a little premature. I guess at the end of the day, it will be a combination of many things. It will be, of course, sleep, circadian sleep, some physical activity, respecting your circadian rhythm by time-restricted eating will form foundation. But on top of that, we also need to understand what are the hormones, what are the micronutrients, what are the macronutrients that we need to change at older age and combine them with this foundation of health to live longer. But in the short term, I guess time-restricted eating will help us to reduce the burden of disease. And it's a huge, lofty goal, because in the US, when somebody goes from healthy to diabetic, type 2 diabetic, then the annual cost of total healthcare cost goes up by $9,000 a year. And if there are 94 million people who are pre-diabetic, and over the next 5 to 6 years, nearly 50% or so will slowly transition towards type 2 diabetic. If we delay diabetes in just 1 million people, then that's, for 1 year, that's $9 billion in savings. And if you can delay that in 10 million or 20 million or 30 million people for X number of years, then we're talking about redirecting that healthcare spending towards other things. So on a macroeconomic level, these kind of lifestyle changes, which can be scaled up at population level, can move the needle to keep the nation, to keep the society more healthy. And then we'll think about the longevity question.
Well said. Well, Satchin, thank you so much. This has been really, really informative, and I think very, very empowering for myself and for the listeners. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for coming on here and sharing, and for all of the work that you've done. Before I get you to give us a bit of a rundown as to where people can find you and information about your various books, etc., is there anything that you feel like we missed or that you wanted to kind of say today that we didn't get to?
No, I think we covered almost everything in mind that most people will find useful. And thank you so much for doing this, because, we scientists are not very good in communicating our science to people who will benefit from it. And thank you for being that important link between science and people who need this.
Oh, thank you. Those are very kind words. I've seen your TED Talks, so I beg to differ. I think you're doing a great job with the science communication as well. For folks who want to read more, learn more, stay in touch with future research that you bring out, where's the best place to kind of direct them?
Well, I'll be soon back to my Twitter feed, so I'll be active in Twitter. And we also have an app called My Circadian Clock, which is available in both iOS and Android. And that's not commercial. That's entirely used for research purpose. So there is no advertising. There is no email storm. And we are learning a lot about people's lifestyle and also what are the barriers to adopting good lifestyle, which is even much more important, because if we don't understand the barriers, then we cannot address how to change the needle, how to move the needle. I also have a couple of books, The Circadian Code, which gives a broad understanding of circadian rhythms, and The Circadian Diabetes Code, which came out last year, which is more focused on glucose control and its complications. And our website, mycircadianclock.org, also has a lot of blogs and patient stories. And of course, our team is involved in many parallel research going on, and almost in every couple of months we have something new coming out, and those are all on our website.
Okay, well, let's stay in touch, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of the listeners. We'd love to have you back on and learn more from you as future studies are published. Thank you so much, Satchin.
Thank you. Have a perfect circadian day.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.